Second part of the sound stimulus and the ear, and we're still getting to really how we are, our range of hearing, and we're going to get to the ear in this part. So our range of hearing goes from 20 hertz or 20 cycles per second to 20,000 hertz or 20,000 cycles per second. And if you remember me saying that low A on the piano is 27.5 hertz, that is right, it's very close, right, to our lower limit of our range of hearing. Speech is about, so human speech uses the frequencies of 2,000 to 4,000 hertz quite a bit, and you're going to see this dip right there in our audibility curves and what we are able to hear. This is what we hear the best. And so I'm sure when we see those dips, and we're going to look at interspecies differences just for fun, because I think it's really interesting, and I often have students who think it's interesting, that those dips where they have the lowest threshold, so the most sensitivity, that is most likely where they are speaking to each other as well, because we really want to hear the specifics of the speech sounds. So we have these frequency intensity relations that when we look at loudness, it depends on intensity or amplitude, but frequency is part of the story because these audibility curves are exactly that. They are curves. They are not straight lines. What do I mean by that? So let's look at our threshold for hearing from about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. And our sensitivity is going to vary within this frequency range. So if we are down there at about 20 hertz, we need something to be about 80 decibels in order to even hear it, so our threshold for hearing. Whereas if we're there at speech, 2,000 to 4,000 hertz, you can see that we can hear that. We can just hear that at the 0 decibel range. And so that 0, or the 0 decibel amplitude. So that 0 decibel amplitude was our measure for this is what we can just hear. And again, at these frequencies that we're hearing the best, that we can get at the lowest threshold. The other thing this picture shows is a threshold for pain. So up there, I'm actually going to say that when we get to about 90 decibels, we're causing some hearing loss. Our threshold for pain being about 110 decibels or so, 120. We're definitely damaging the system when we are feeling pain from something being too loud. And one of the things that the Goldstein book does very well is to show how or why really this means that our perception of loudness isn't just strictly amplitude, but we do have to consider frequency. Because if we look at, so again, that letter A on there, let's just say that's 27.5 hertz as we're down to there close to 70 hertz. Close to 20 hertz. That 27.5 hertz at 40 decibels at that amplitude, we don't even hear it. If we go up to 100 hertz, that letter B there, at 40 decibels, it's just at our threshold of hearing. We're just able to hear it. We go up to 1,000 hertz, so we're getting close to the speech range where we're really sensitive, and we have those low thresholds. Now at 40 decibels, that same decibel, so that same amplitude, now it's at the level of conversational speech. And if we go back down to that 100 hertz, that particular frequency, that lower frequency, I would need to get that up to 60 decibels, up to that higher amplitude, in order to get it to the same loudness. Which again, why loudness is not just amplitude, but frequency needs to be considered because we have these audibility curves and they are curves. You will notice that one of the things I add really often is these interspecies differences. I think they're fun and fascinating. I usually put this up in class and just tell students to look at it and see if they have any questions. But since we're in a video, I'm just going to tell you some of the things that I think are interesting and neat. So you can see that dogs are hearing at those at lower decibel levels, at lower amplitudes than we are, after we get up about 10,000 hertz. As we get past 20,000 hertz, they can still hear, and we are not hearing so much. So that is how dog whistles are made. They're up there at frequencies that we cannot hear, but your dog can. If you look at mice and that they have this dip down at about 35,000 hertz or so, because notice that there is a squashing or compressing of the figure as we get up to 100,000 and 2,000 hertz. So it used to be they thought that mother mice found their little mouselings by pheromones and sense of smell, but it turns out when they got the instrumentation for being able to hear these higher frequencies, that it turns out that those infant mice are squeaking at these high frequencies, and so their mothers can hear them. We can look at what dolphins, where they are speaking to each other, are in these extremely high frequencies that we cannot hear. Personally, I have been in the ocean close to dolphins talking, and I can feel it a little bit in my neck, and it's painful. These high frequencies, which is very interesting, although other members of my family did not feel that. And then we'll look briefly at elephants. And you can notice here's this frequency range where they're not hearing. And it actually looks like, so for a long time we thought elephants communicated just in those frequencies that we can hear, right up in the 5,000, 10,000, maybe 20,000 range, and that they needed a pretty high amplitude to hear it. It turns out when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, they discovered that elephants are also communicating to each other in these very low frequencies, under 20 hertz. And so we weren't hearing it, and we didn't realize it. And we can talk about this as hearing, kind of like when I mentioned that snakes put their tongues out and sense that infrared electromagnetic radiation, that we can talk about that as seeing, but it's actually a little bit different because they're not, I don't know that they're hearing with their ears. My understanding is the way these lower frequencies work is they're sending them through the ground to communicate dangers that are far away. So when they're far away from the group, they can communicate to the group kind of farther away. So presumably they're actually feeling with their touch receptors those sound vibrations. Another important audibility threshold to look at is what happens when we are having some kind of hearing impairment due to aging. If you look at the normal, or the quote normal hearing, that up at those higher frequencies we can hear at these lower decibel levels, but as we become impaired, we need those to be higher amplitudes in order to hear them. And this, so if you remember when we talked about presbyopia, old sight, I mentioned that this is going to happen to us. It happens because of the lens becoming more dense and crystalline, and the ciliary muscles, those muscles getting weaker, and this is just something that happens, and it appears to be genetic, and there's not much we can do about it. Presbycusis, what we call old hearing, is different. This appears to be a much more of a problem in industrialized or developed nations because of industrialization. For a long time, it was happening more to males than to females, and it happened more to people who were working in mills and in loud environments. And so OSHA has come along and made rules about working in loud environments. I will say I'm not sure those rules necessarily apply the way we want them to. You're supposed to give people breaks if they're in noises over 80 to 90 decibels. They're supposed to have a break every 50 minutes or hour or so, but or they can give them hearing earplugs. I have a couple of students have told me that they have parents who work in these industrial plants, and they're given earplugs and told you can wear these if you want to, but a lot of people choose not to because they're uncomfortable and then they can't hear other things that are going on. And so maybe we're still having a lot of work-related hearing loss. What we tend to have these days, we still have hearing loss, and a lot of it's due to leisure-related hearing loss. And so in one of the textbooks, I think it was a couple editions ago, he showed how long and how loud it was at, I think it was a soccer game, because people were screaming. So whether we're in concerts, people are screaming, we're listening to our music too loud, we are damaging our hearing. And really, the only thing we need to do to stop that damage is to take breaks every 50 minutes or so, as we will see the middle ear muscles, they're going to constrain and tighten when we're in a loud environment, and they're going to protect our inner ears, but we're basically wearing them down when we're listening to loud sounds for that amount of time. Okay, so we get this information to the ear, and we are going to talk about the ear and the mechanics of the ear, and starting with these three basic tasks of our auditory system, where we want to deliver that sound stimulus to the sensory receptors so that, two, they can transduce the stimulus from those pressure changes into electrochemical information, action potentials. And we also want to process those signals so that they can indicate for us pitch, loudness, timbre, and location. So I'm going to do my little bit of sound localization here because nobody mentioned it in their interests, that they were interested in sound localization. Notice that so far what we've talked about with the stimulus, it gives us information about pitch with its frequency, loudness with its amplitude, as long as we take into account frequency, and timbre with the mixture of those harmonics and those different frequencies that make up a waveform. It does not tell us about location in the same way as if you remember what we did with vision, we have the visual field, we have our visual space. It is hitting the retina of the eye. We're maintaining information about that space very specifically, and that information is maintained all the way to the visual cortex so that we can tell where things are very precisely in space. But sound is different. So if this recording, if you're listening to this and it's off to your left, it's going to hit your left ear first on an order of microseconds, so 10,000ths of a second. It's going to hit your left ear first, and it's going to hit your left ear slightly louder, and that's going to tell you that that's happening over to your left. And when we talk about the pinnae, I'll talk about it helping us to localize sound. It's helping us localize sound in elevation. And so this localization, it's actually being calculated in those subcortical structures of the brain, and it's not going to be as precise as vision. Notice that when you're hearing that songbird sing, if it's a songbird that kind of looks, it's kind of camouflaged, you can't see it very well, you have to wait till it moves and you see it to know exactly where it is. If it's a cardinal or something and it captures your attention with color, then you know where it is, but you're going to be looking in a basic area. So this is a fun, I think, a fun game to play of localizing the birds and thinking about how you're doing this with your sense of sound. But you don't know exactly where that bird is until you see it with your eyes. Your sense of vision gives you that specificity in space. As we get this information to the sensory receptors, the ear, the mechanics of the ear, we're going to start with the outer ear, talk about the middle ear, and then about the inner ear. We look at this slide, so sound is coming in from where you're seeing on the right, being captured by the pinna or the pinnae, which I'll probably continue to call them the pinnae as they are, that's the plural. They get funneled down that auditory canal and hit the eardrum or the tympanic membrane, and that's the outer ear. The middle ear, that hammer, anvil, and stirrup, or what I'm used to calling the malleus, incus, and stapes. We'll talk about those three ossicles, the smallest, together they're called the ossicles, the smallest bones in your body. And that gets the information to the inner ear, that cochlea. So cochlea is Greek for shell, and that you can see that shell-looking thing. That is where we are going to be. Okay, you can see on the top as well of the inner ear, we see these semicircular canals. That's really more about our vestibular sense and our movement sense, as you can see they're going in 3 different directions in space, so I can tell which way I'm turning my head or whether I'm upside down, and they're really about whether I'm accelerating in a particular direction. But we will not talk about the semicircular canals. We're going to stay there in the cochlea. If we look at the outer ear, there are three parts that we want to talk about. The pinna, or the pinnae. When we're looking at someone's ears or talking about someone's ears, that's probably what we're talking about. The auditory canal and the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. So the pinna was the singular of the pinnae, and there it is there, that kind of the plural. When we are looking at someone and we say that, look at that person's ears, we're talking about the pinnae, what we see of the ears. They help to capture the sound. They help us to localize the sound on the vertical plane. If you remember me saying, if something's over to the left, we have these interaural time differences, interaural intensity differences. But what I said is it's going to hit the left ear first, that time difference. It's going to hit the left ear louder, that intensity difference. But for the vertical plane, we're using information from the pinnae. It is fun to look at the pinnae of other animals. You can see that the larger the pinnae, the more sound, right, that I'm going to be capturing. But you can also think of, or I like to think of, those prey animals like rabbits that where they are moving their ears around. It's not just prey animals, because cats do this as well. They move their ears around. When we talked about the superior colliculus, the superior colliculi, and that they're helping us to figure out where to move our eyes, we have inferior colliculi that are performing similar jobs of telling us where things are happening in space to some extent. But for these animals who move their ears, their inferior colliculi are going to be larger than ours because they're providing that information too, right? They're telling them where are my ears, how are they pointed, and then where do I want to point them as part of all that calculation of information. If we look at the owl, and I often have people in class guess where the pinnae are, or I might say where the pinna is, because it is the owl's entire face. We have to remember that they are creatures of the night. They are hunting at night, and they need really precise location information with their hearing, since they're not using their vision for that. The next piece of the outer ear is the auditory canal. So we get that's those sound pressure waves funneled down the auditory canal. It is approximately 3 centimeters long. It is filled with wax. That is what we're cleaning out when we have gunk in our ears, as I have a lot with my allergies. It protects the tympanic membrane and the inner ear. And it also, so it has its own resonant frequency, this frequency that is reinforced the most. If you've ever had an argument with a friend where they say they don't like someone's voice and you say, well, I really like that person's voice, and isn't that weird? And why don't you? So I actually have somebody who really dislikes the voice of the guy who sings for Muse. He says it sounds whiny. I'm like, I love that guy's voice. It sounds sweet and mellifluous to me. So obviously it's resonating nicely in my auditory canal and not resonating so nicely in his auditory canal. The third and final part of the outer ear is the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane. Most of us call this the eardrum, but remembering that it's a membrane at this point is a really good thing to do, because we're going to see a lot of membranes in our in the mechanics of the ear and the inner ear and so forth, because these changes in sound pressure, that they can have these kind of wrinkles that makes them very complicated. And so we want something that is soft and malleable and can be doing different things kind of at different places, if that makes sense. We get to the middle ear, and we are again going to have three parts of the middle ear. They are the ossicles. These ossicles are collectively, they are known as the ossicles, the three smallest bones in our bodies, the malleus, incus, and stapes, or in English, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. If you're a particularly mechanical person, those names might help you. For me, I don't find them helpful. but I'll always try to give you both. As for me, the malleus, incus, and stapes seem like the real names, and if you've ever heard of stapectomy, that's somebody having that stapes removed. If you notice what's happening at the tympanic membrane, that we have this kind of large surface space and it's hitting the hammer or the anvil, the hammer or the malleus with this large surface space. And then we're moving to the end of the stapes where we're dealing with a smaller surface space. So this is giving a kind of fulcrum action, because what we're doing as we're getting that information through the physical medium of air, so far it's been going through the physical medium of air. These bones are going to amplify that sound, because when we get off to the right there into the inner ear, we're going into the medium of liquid. Okay, and if you've ever, so do this if you've never done it, but I'm sure you have, floating in the water at some point, you've noticed that it's calming, right? Because everything's muffled or attenuated. You can't really hear what's happening out there. So when we go from air to liquid, things get muffled and attenuated. And so we are moving here from air to liquid, and those three bones are allowing for this amplification of the sound. And so the malleus is going to move the incus, is going to move the stapes is going to push and pull on that oval window, which is another membrane, and that brings it to the inner ear. The other aspect of the middle ear that we want to talk about is the middle ear muscles that are going to constrict and tighten when we are trying to dampen sound. So when we are in high intensity sounds, those middle ear muscles are going to help protect the inner ear. You might notice I like to talk from pictures, but then I often have the wordy slides on here to help us kind of make sure you have the language. So we are amplifying the sound with the middle ear ossicles. We're going from the eardrum to the oval window, or the tympanic membrane to the oval window. We are going from an air system to a liquid system, so we need to amplify that signal. So the ossicles have this kind of fulcrum or lever action. We're also, with the middle ear, dampening high intensity signals. This is done by muscles, right? Those middle ear muscles are constricting, and this is why we want to take breaks from loud music or loud sounds or screaming or industrial sounds, because those middle ear muscles are going to fatigue and they're not going to be able to provide that protection except for only so long. We're getting this to the inner ear, and I'm going to stop here so we can start get into the inner ear on its own. But so that stirrup or stapes is pushing and pulling on this oval window. We're going to see this wave of liquid go down the scala vestibuli and then go up to the middle part of the ear, of the inner ear, and come back down the scala tympani. And it's affecting and then hit the round window. And what it's affecting is the cochlear petition, which is where the action is, where the basilar membrane is going to, well, we're going to talk about what the organ of Corti and the basilar membrane, how that is going to translate these air pressure changes, which have now become a wave of liquid, in waves with different kinds of properties, how that's going to affect the basilar membrane. That's going to tell us about pitch, loudness, and timbre.